The lights of station flickered in the endless dark of space. The station floated near a giant purple planet, far from Earth and far from any place that felt like home. It was a mining colony where humans dug precious metals from nearby asteroids. Traders came and went. Ships docked and departed. Life moved forward in its slow and tired rhythm. Daniel wiped the grease from his hands and looked at the clock on the wall. His shift was ending. He had spent 12 hours fixing broken engines and patching damaged hull plates. His back ached and his eyes were heavy. He was 43 years old and felt every single year of it. He walked through the repair bay one last time, checking that all his tools were in their proper places. Daniel was a man of routine. He liked things orderly. He liked silence. Most people on the station knew him as the quiet mechanic who kept to himself. He did not attend the social gatherings in the commons. He did not drink at the bar with the miners. He simply worked and then returned to his small quarters alone. 7 years ago, Daniel had been a different man. He had smiled more. He had laughed more. He had a wife named and a daughter named Lily. But the fever outbreak took them both within a single week. The colony doctors did everything they could, but some things cannot be fixed no matter how hard you try. Daniel learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Now he lived with a hollow space inside his chest where his family used to be. He did not speak about them. He did not keep their pictures on display, but he thought about them every single day. The alarm at the cargo docks began to wail. Daniel paused at the doorway of his bay and listened. Alarms were common on the station. Usually they meant nothing serious. A ship arriving without proper clearance. A drunk miner causing trouble. Small problems that security could handle without help. But something made Daniel walk toward the sound instead of away from it. The cargo docks were on the lower level of the station, near the airlocks where ships connected for loading and unloading. Daniel took the lift down and stepped into a scene of confusion. Security officers were gathered near the main gate. Colonists had stopped their work to watch. Everyone was staring at something on the ground. Daniel pushed his way through the small crowd and saw her. She was a child, but she was not human. Her skin was covered in scales that should have been bright blue but had faded to a dull gray. 2 small horns curved back from her forehead. A pair of wings hung limp and torn from her shoulders. Her eyes were large and golden, but they held no light, only exhaustion and pain. Daniel recognized her species immediately. The dragon people, some humans called them. They were proud and fierce and wanted nothing to do with humanity. The 2 species had no treaties and no alliances. The believed humans were chaotic and dangerous. They kept their distance whenever possible. But this child had come to a human station, and she had not come alone. Behind her she dragged a makeshift sled built from scrap metal and old fabric. On the sled lay the body of a young male. He was larger than her, perhaps 2 or 3 years older. His scales were the same faded gray. His eyes were closed. His chest did not move. He was dead. The girl collapsed to her knees at the security checkpoint. She was too weak to stand any longer. Her claws scraped against the metal floor as she tried to pull herself forward, but her body had nothing left to give. Greg, the senior security officer on duty, stepped in front of her. He was a tall man with a hard face and no patience for problems that fell outside his protocols. "You cannot enter the station," Greg said. His voice was flat and cold. "Have no treaty with this colony. We have no resources for refugees. You need to leave." The girl looked up at him. Her golden eyes were wet with tears that left dark streaks down her gray scales. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was barely a sound. She spoke in broken common, the trade language used across the galaxy. "My brother, he is dead. I carried him so far, so many days. I only want to bury him. Then I will go. I promise I will go." Greg shook his head. "Burial services are for registered colonists only. I cannot help you." The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Some of them looked away. Nobody wanted to meet the child's eyes. It was easier to pretend she was not there. It was easier to follow the rules and let someone else worry about the consequences. The girl did not argue. She did not beg. She simply lowered her head and placed her small clawed hand on her brother's cold chest. Then she began to weep. The sound she made was unlike anything Daniel had ever heard. It was low and broken and filled with a grief that seemed too large for such a small body to hold. Daniel stood frozen in the crowd. His heart pounded in his chest. His throat felt tight. He thought about his daughter Lily and the way she used to laugh. He thought about standing beside her grave on a distant world, alone and destroyed, and wondering how he would survive the next minute. This child had walked through the stars carrying her dead brother. She had been turned away by everyone. She had nothing left, and all she wanted was to put him in the ground with some small measure of dignity. The rules said she was not entitled to help. The protocol said she was not their problem. Every logical part of Daniel's brain told him to walk away and let security handle it. But Daniel was not thinking with logic. He was thinking with something deeper and older and more human than any rule could ever be. He stepped out of the crowd. Greg noticed him immediately. "This does not concern you. Go back to your bay." Daniel ignored him. He walked past the security officers and knelt down beside the girl. She flinched away from him, raising her arms to protect her face. She expected to be hit. She expected to be dragged away and thrown out of the airlock. That was what she had learned to expect from the universe. Daniel did not hit her. He did not grab her. He simply placed his rough and calloused hand on her trembling shoulder and spoke in the softest voice he could manage. "What is your name, child?" She lowered her arms slowly. Her golden eyes searched his face, looking for the trick, looking for the cruelty that surely must be hiding beneath his gentle words. But she found nothing except a tired old mechanic with sad eyes and grease stains on his shirt. She whispered, "My name is." Daniel nodded. He looked at the body on the sled. The dead boy looked peaceful, as though he were only sleeping. "And your brother?" "His name was." Daniel took a deep breath. He could feel the eyes of the entire crowd burning into his back. He could feel Greg's anger radiating from behind him. He knew what he was about to do would cause problems. He knew there would be consequences. He did not care. He said quietly, "I am going to help you bury your brother." Stared at Daniel with disbelief in her golden eyes. She had heard the words he spoke, but she could not understand them. No one had ever offered to help her, not once in all the months since her world had fallen apart. She waited for him to take back his promise. She waited for the trick to reveal itself. But Daniel simply looked at her with calm and steady eyes and waited for her to respond. "You will help me?" she asked. Her voice cracked on the words. "Yes." Greg stepped forward with anger burning in his face. "You cannot do this. Station protocol is clear. Non-treaty species are not entitled to station resources. If you proceed with this, I will report you to Administrator Vance. There will be consequences." Daniel stood up slowly. His knees ached from kneeling on the hard metal floor. He turned to face Greg and spoke without raising his voice. "Then report me." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Greg was taller and younger and stronger, but there was something in Daniel's eyes that made the security officer hesitate. It was the look of a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Greg stepped aside. Daniel bent down and lifted its body from the sled. The young was heavier than he expected, but Daniel did not struggle. He cradled the boy carefully, supporting his head the way a father would carry a sleeping child. Scales were cold against Daniel's arms. His wings hung limp and still. "Come with me," Daniel said too. She rose on shaking legs and followed him. The crowd parted to let them pass. Some colonists watched with curiosity. Others watched with disapproval. A few watched with something that might have been shame. Daniel carried through the corridors of the station toward his repair bay. walked beside him in silence. Her claws clicked softly against the metal floor with each step. She kept glancing up at Daniel as though she expected him to change his mind at any moment. When they reached the repair bay, Daniel laid's body on a clean workbench. He found a cloth and covered the boy gently. Then he pulled up a stool for her and gestured for her to sit. "You need to rest," he said. "When did you last eat?" Shook her head. "I do not remember many days." Daniel went to a small cabinet in the corner of the bay. He kept emergency rations there for long shifts when he could not leave his work. He pulled out a packet of dried fruit and a container of water and brought them to the girl. "Eat slowly," he said. "Your stomach will hurt if you eat too fast." Took the food with trembling claws. She ate carefully, one small piece at a time, just as Daniel had instructed. Tears continued to roll down her scaled cheeks, but she did not make a sound. She had cried so much in recent days that she had no sobs left inside her. Daniel sat across from her and waited. He did not push her to speak. He did not ask questions. He simply stayed with her and let her eat in peace. When she had finished the food and drank half the water, finally looked up at him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Your people and my people are not friends. We have always stayed apart. I have nothing to give you. I cannot pay you." Daniel thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Because you asked," he said simply, "and because I remember what it feels like to bury someone you love." Studied his face. She was young, but she had learned to read people during her months of wandering. She could see the old pain hiding behind his eyes. She understood that this human carried his own grief, just as she carried hers. "Tell me about your brother," Daniel said. The words unlocked something inside. She began to speak, and once she started, she could not stop. She told Daniel about their home world, a planet called Prime. She told him about their clan, who lived in the mountain caves and hunted in the deep forests. She told him about the civil war that erupted 2 years ago between rival clans fighting for territory and power. Their parents had died in the first wave of attacks, had been only 8 years old, was 10. They had no other family to take them in. Orphans were considered burdens among the. They were given no protection and no resources. They were expected to survive on their own or die quietly without troubling anyone. So and had fled. They stowed away on cargo ships and wandered from station to station and planet to planet. They begged for scraps and slept in alleyways and learned to trust no one. Every colony they reached turned them away. They did not want them because orphans had no value. Other species did not want them because they had no treaties and no allies. 3 months ago had begun to cough. A respiratory infection guessed, though she had no medical knowledge. They had no money for medicine and no access to doctors. She watched her brother grow weaker day by day. His scales lost their shine. His breathing became labored, but he refused to stop moving. He told they had to keep going. He told her they would find a place that would accept them eventually. He died in his sleep 12 days before they reached station. Woke up beside him one morning and found his body cold. She screamed until her voice gave out. Then she built the sled from scraps she found in a garbage pile and began to drag him toward the nearest human colony. She did not know why she chose a human station. Perhaps because she had run out of other options. Perhaps because some small part of her hoped that humans would be different. She had heard stories about them. Strange stories. Stories that said humans sometimes helped strangers for no reason at all. "I promised him," whispered. Her voice was barely audible. "Before he died, I promised I would not leave him behind. I promised I would bury him properly, the way our parents were buried, with words spoken over his body, with a marker to show where he rests." She looked at Daniel with desperate eyes. "I cannot carry him anymore. My body is broken, I have no strength left, but I cannot leave him in the cold. I cannot let him drift in the void. Please, help me keep my promise. That is all I ask. Then I will go away and never trouble you again." Daniel reached out and took her small clawed hand in his rough calloused palm. He held it gently, the way he used to hold his daughter's hand when she was frightened. "You will not go away," he said. "You will stay here until you are strong again. And tomorrow, when the sun rises over the planet below, we will bury your brother together. I give you my word." Stared at him. She did not understand this human. She did not understand his kindness or his gentleness or his willingness to help a stranger who had nothing to offer in return. But for the first time in many months, she felt something she had forgotten was possible. She felt hope. Outside the repair bay, the station continued its slow orbit through the darkness. Most colonists went about their routines without knowing or caring about the alien child in the mechanic's shop, but word was beginning to spread. Whispers moved through the corridors like wind through tall grass. The mechanic was helping the dragon girl. The mechanic was going to bury her brother. And some people were starting to wonder if maybe they should help too. Daniel gave a blanket and made a small bed for her in the corner of the repair bay. She was asleep within minutes, her exhausted body finally surrendering to rest. He sat beside her for a while, watching her breathe, making sure she was truly safe before he began his work. He had made a promise, now he had to keep it. The station was not designed for burials. There was no cemetery and no funeral home. When colonists died, their bodies were usually cremated and their ashes scattered into space. But Daniel remembered what it said about customs. They buried their dead in the ground. They marked the graves with stones. They believed the spirit needed a physical place to rest. Daniel walked to the supply depot and gathered the materials he would need. A shovel, a pickaxe, some metal plates he could weld into a grave marker. He loaded everything onto a cargo cart and began pushing it toward the airlock that led outside the dome. The station sat on a rocky moon with thin atmosphere and weak gravity. The colonists rarely went outside except for emergency repairs, but there was solid ground out there, ground that could hold a grave. Daniel was halfway to the airlock when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw walking toward him, ran the small medical clinic on the station. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. Daniel had fixed her diagnostic equipment many times over the years. They were not friends exactly, but they had always been polite to each other. "I heard what you are doing," said. Daniel nodded but said nothing. He expected her to tell him he was being foolish. He expected her to warn him about the consequences. Instead, she held up a bundle of white cloth. "I brought a shroud," she said, "for the boy's body. It is clean and soft. I thought it might be better than the work cloth you have now." Daniel looked at the shroud and then at. He did not know what to say. "Thank you," he managed finally. Smiled. "I am coming with you. You will need help digging in that rocky ground." Before Daniel could respond, another voice called out from down the corridor. "Wait for me." Perry came jogging toward them. Was a miner, a big man with thick arms and a loud voice. He worked deep in the asteroid tunnels and rarely spoke to anyone outside his crew. But here he was, carrying his own shovel over his shoulder. "I heard about the girl," said. "Heard security tried to throw her out. Heard you stood up for her." He shrugged his massive shoulders. "Figured you could use some muscle. That ground outside is hard as steel." Daniel stared at him. "You could get in trouble for this." Laughed. "I have been in trouble before. Never stopped me yet." They continued toward the airlock. More people joined them along the way. A cook named Maria appeared with containers of hot food for. A young engineer named brought welding equipment to help build the grave marker. 2 miners from S crew arrived with extra tools. An elderly woman named Ruth, who worked in the station archive, came carrying a small book of poems she thought might be appropriate for the ceremony. By the time Daniel reached the airlock, nearly 20 people had gathered behind him. They came from different departments and different backgrounds. Some had never spoken to each other before, but they had all heard the same story. A child had come to their station carrying her dead brother. She had asked for help, and one mechanic had answered. Now they wanted to answer too. Daniel looked at the crowd and felt something stir in his chest. He had spent 7 years building walls around his heart. He had convinced himself that he was better off alone. But standing here with these people, seeing their faces full of determination and compassion, he realized he had been wrong. Humans were strange creatures. They could be selfish and cruel and short-sighted. They could ignore suffering when it was convenient. They could follow rules even when the rules were wrong. But somewhere deep inside them, there was also this: a spark of kindness that refused to die, a need to help those who could not help themselves. The group went outside through the airlock, wearing pressure suits and carrying their tools. The rocky ground was indeed hard, just as had predicted, but they worked together, taking turns with the pickaxes and shovels. They dug through stone and frozen soil. They carved out a grave on a small ridge that overlooked the station dome. It took most of the night. By the time they finished, everyone was exhausted. Their suits were covered in dust. Their muscles ached, but the grave was ready. It was deep and straight and lined with smooth stones that had found nearby. They returned inside just as the artificial dawn began to brighten the dome. Daniel went to check on and found her awake, sitting beside her brother's body. She looked up at him with confusion in her eyes. "People came," she said. "Many people. A woman brought me this cloth for, another woman brought me food. A man brought flowers made of metal because real flowers do not grow here. I do not understand. Why do they help? They do not know me." Daniel sat down across from her. "They know enough," he said. "They know you are a child who lost her brother. They know you walked through the stars to give him a proper burial. They know you deserve better than to be turned away." Shook her head. "Among my people, orphans have no value. We are forgotten as soon as we are gone. No one would do this for us. No one would work through the night for a dead boy with no clan and no name." Daniel thought about those words. He thought about how different they were from humans. They were strong and proud and ancient. They had built empires that spanned the galaxy while humans were still living in caves. But they had also created a society that threw away its weakest members. A society that measured worth in power and status and bloodlines. Humans were younger and messier and more chaotic. They made terrible mistakes. They fought wars over foolish things. They destroyed as much as they created. But they also did things like this. They gathered in the middle of the night to dig a grave for a stranger. They gave their time and their strength to a child they would never see again. "You have value," Daniel said firmly. "Your brother had value, and today everyone on the station is going to see that." He stood up and offered her his hand. "The grave is ready. It is time to say goodbye." Took his hand and rose to her feet. She was still weak and tired, but there was something new in her golden eyes. A light that had not been there before. A flicker of something that might become strength if given enough time to grow. Together, they walked out of the repair bay to bury beneath the stars. The sun rose over the purple gas giant that dominated the sky beyond the station dome. Light poured through the transparent panels and painted everything in shades of gold and violet. It was beautiful in a way that made the heart ache. It was the kind of morning that made people stop and remember that the universe could still surprise them. More than 40 people had gathered on the ridge outside the dome. They stood in a wide circle around the grave that they had dug through the night. Miners stood beside engineers. Cooks stood beside doctors. Security officers stood beside cargo handlers. They wore their pressure suits and carried small oxygen tanks for the thin atmosphere, and they waited in silence for the ceremony to begin. Daniel carried his body in his arms, had wrapped the boy in the clean white shroud she had brought. His face was visible, his eyes closed and peaceful, his small horns catching the morning light. He looked like he was dreaming of better places. Walked beside Daniel. She moved slowly, her torn wings dragging slightly behind her, but she held her head high. She would not stumble, she would not fall, not today, not in front of her brother. They reached the edge of the grave and stopped. Daniel looked at the gathered crowd and felt a wave of emotion that he could not name. These people had no reason to be here. They had jobs and responsibilities and lives of their own. They gained nothing from standing on this cold ridge at dawn, but they had come anyway. Because sometimes that was what humans did. Daniel lowered's body gently into the grave. He positioned the boy carefully, supporting his head and arranging his limbs so he looked comfortable. He made sure the wings were folded neatly at his sides, just the way had described when she told him about burial customs. Then he stepped back and turned to. "Is there anything special we should do?" he asked. "Any words your people say at times like this?" Thought for a moment. "We anoint the scales with oil, but I have no oil." Stepped forward. "I have medical oil, will that work?" Nodded and handed her a small bottle. The girl climbed carefully down into the grave and knelt beside her brother. She poured the oil onto her small clawed hands and rubbed it gently over scales. She started at his forehead and worked her way down, covering every part of him with the shining liquid. As she worked, she began to sing. It was a funeral song, ancient and mournful and unlike any sound the humans had ever heard. Her voice was thin and cracked from exhaustion, but the melody was haunting. It rose and fell like wind through mountain caves. It spoke of loss and love and the long journey to whatever waited beyond death. The colonists stood in silence and listened. Some of them had tears on their cheeks. Others looked down at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. They did not understand the words, but they understood the feeling. Every species in the galaxy knew grief. Every species knew what it meant to lose someone they loved. When the song ended, climbed out of the grave and stood beside Daniel. Her golden eyes were dry now. She had no more tears left, but she looked at peace in a way she had not looked before. Daniel stepped forward to speak. He was not good with words. He had never been the kind of man who made speeches or gave toasts at parties. But he had promised to help bury this boy, and that meant saying something worth hearing. "I did not know," he began. His voice was rough and low. "I never met him when he was alive. I only know what his sister told me. She said he was brave. She said he protected her when no one else would. She said he walked across the stars to find her a safe place to live, even when his body was failing and his strength was gone." Daniel paused and looked at the faces around him. "That is what I call a hero. Not someone with power or wealth or a famous name, but someone who loves their family so much that they keep going even when everything is against them. Was a hero, and we are honored to be here today to lay him to rest." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. He held it up so everyone could see. "On Earth, where my ancestors come from, there is an old tradition. When you visit the grave of someone you respect, you leave a stone behind. It is a way of saying that you were there, a way of saying that you remember, a way of saying that this person mattered." Daniel stepped forward and placed his stone on the edge of the grave. "Mattered." One by one, the colonists came forward. Each of them had brought a stone, gathered from the rocky ground outside the dome. Perry placed his stone with a quiet nod, whispered a blessing as she set hers down. Maria crossed herself in the old way before adding her stone to the growing pile. Ruth, Greg, who had tried to turn away, and dozens of others came forward until the grave was surrounded by a ring of stones. Watched all of this with wide eyes. Her mouth hung open in disbelief. Among her people, only clan elders received such ceremonies. Only warriors who had won great battles were honored this way. Orphans were buried in unmarked holes, forgotten before the dirt was cold. But these humans, these strange and unpredictable creatures, had given her brother the funeral of a king. When everyone had placed their stones, Daniel knelt down and picked up a handful of dirt. He held it over the grave and let it fall slowly through his fingers. "Rest now," he said softly. "Your journey is over, your sister is safe. You kept your promise to her, now let us keep ours." The colonists began to fill the grave. They worked together, passing shovels and moving dirt, until his body was covered by the rocky soil of this distant moon. Then came forward with the marker he had welded from scrap metal. It was simple but beautiful, shaped like a traditional grave stone that had described. His name was etched into the surface in both common script and glyphs. They planted the marker at the head of the grave and stepped back. It was done. Stood at the foot of her brother's grave and stared at the marker. She could not speak. She could not move. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had prayed for during the long and terrible months of wandering, had come true in a way she never could have imagined. Daniel came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder and let her know that she was not alone. Behind them, Vance, the station administrator, stood at the edge of the crowd. She had come to reprimand Daniel for his breach of protocol. She had prepared a speech about rules and resources and the importance of maintaining order. But the words died in her throat as she looked at the scene before her. She turned and walked away in silence. Some things were more important than protocol. The days after the funeral passed quietly. Daniel brought to his quarters a small room with a bed and a workbench and little else. He gave her the bed and made himself a sleeping spot on the floor near the door. She protested at first, saying she could not take his only bed, but he insisted. "You need rest more than I do," he said. "Your body is still healing. Sleep." She slept for 3 days straight. Her body had been pushed beyond its limits during the long months of wandering, and now it demanded payment. Daniel checked on her every few hours, making sure she was breathing, making sure she was warm, making sure she was safe. He had not taken care of anyone since his daughter died. He had forgotten how it felt. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like something he had been missing without knowing it. When finally woke, she was stronger. Her scales had begun to regain some of their blue color. Her eyes were brighter. She sat up in the bed and looked around the small room as though seeing it for the first time. "I am still here," she said quietly. "I thought maybe I had dreamed it all." Daniel smiled from his seat at the workbench. "You are still here, and you are welcome to stay as long as you need." Climbed out of bed and walked over to him. She watched as he repaired a small engine component, her golden eyes following his hands with intense interest. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Fixing a fuel injector. It is broken." "Can you teach me?" Daniel looked at her. There was something in her face that he recognized, a hunger to learn, a need to be useful, a desire to prove that she had value. "Yes," he said, "I can teach you." And so he did. Over the following weeks became Daniel's apprentice. She learned how to use the welding torch and the precision tools. She learned how to read technical diagrams and diagnose mechanical problems. She was a quick study, faster than any human child Daniel had ever seen. Her small clawed hands were nimble and precise. Her mind absorbed information like dry soil absorbing rain. The colonists grew used to seeing the dragon girl in the repair bay. They stopped starring and started waving. Maria brought extra portions of food from the kitchen. Perry showed her how to work the heavy mining equipment. Ruth gave her books to read so she could improve her common. Was no longer a stranger. She was part of the station now. But the story did not end there. Traders passed through station on their way to other destinations. They saw the blue-scaled girl working in the human repair bay. They asked questions and received answers. They carried the story back to their home worlds, spreading it through the trade routes and merchant networks that connected the people. An orphaned child, turned away by everyone, had been given sanctuary by humans. Her brother, a nameless refugee with no clan and no status, had been buried with the honors of a hero. Dozens of humans had worked through the night to dig his grave. They had sung for him and wept for him and marked his resting place with stones. The elders were stunned. They gathered in their council chambers and debated what this meant. Humans had always been viewed as chaotic and dangerous, too emotional and too unpredictable to be trusted. They made decisions based on feelings rather than logic. They valued individuals over clans and families over bloodlines. Everything about them was strange and alien and wrong. And yet, the humans had not asked for payment. They had not demanded a treaty or a trade agreement or any kind of reward. They had simply seen a child in need and decided to help her. That was all. That was everything. 3 months after the funeral, a ship arrived at station requesting permission to dock. It was not a trade vessel. It was a diplomatic cruiser bearing the symbols of the High Council. Vance nearly fainted when she received the transmission. The envoy who stepped off the ship was an elderly with silver scales and ancient eyes. His name was, and he had served on the High Council for over a century. He asked to speak with the human who had buried the orphan boy. He asked to speak with Daniel. Daniel met him in the station commons, stood at his side, wearing new clothes that Maria had sewn for her and a tool belt that Daniel had given her as a gift. She was nervous but proud. She had never seen a council elder before. Studied Daniel for a long moment. Then he bowed his great horned head in a gesture of respect that knew was reserved only for the most honored leaders. "We have watched many species in this galaxy," said. His voice was deep and resonant like thunder rolling through distant mountains. "We have seen empires rise and fall. We have observed the powerful and the wise and the ancient. But we have never seen anything like what happened on this station." He lifted his head and looked directly into Daniel's eyes. "You buried the forgotten. You honored those who had no value in our society. You gained nothing from your actions. You risked punishment from your own leadership. And still you came, all of you, to give dignity to a dead boy and hope to a lost child." The elder turned to face the crowd of colonists who had gathered to watch. His silver eyes swept over their faces. "We wish to understand such a people. We wish to learn from you. The High Council has authorized me to propose a treaty between thee and humanity. The first treaty our people have ever offered to any outside species. We offer this not because you are powerful or wealthy or useful to us. We offer it because you showed us something we had forgotten." He paused. "Compassion, true compassion, given freely to those who cannot repay it. That is something worth more than all the power in the galaxy." The treaty was signed 1 week later in a formal ceremony broadcast across human space. Daniel did not attend. He was in his repair bay, teaching how to calibrate a plasma cutter. She had made remarkable progress in recent months. She was going to be an excellent mechanic someday. "Daniel," she said as she worked on the calibration, "the elder said you changed things. He said what you did will be remembered for generations." Daniel shrugged and handed her a different tool. "I did not do anything special. I just helped a child who needed help. Anyone would have done the same." Shook her head. Her scales had fully recovered their bright blue color now. Her wings were healing. She looked nothing like the broken creature who had collapsed at the security checkpoint all those months ago. "No," she said quietly. "Not anyone, only you, only humans." She set down the tool and looked at him with her golden eyes full of warmth. "My people believe that orphans have no value, that the weak should be forgotten, that kindness is weakness. But you showed me something different. You showed me that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is be gentle. Sometimes the bravest thing is to care when no one expects you to." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about his daughter Lily and the years he had spent grieving alone. He thought about the walls he had built and the life he had himself. And he thought about how a broken dragon girl had crashed through all of those walls simply by asking for help. "Thank you," said, "for everything." Daniel put his hand on her shoulder and smiled for the first time in 7 years. "You are welcome," he said. "Now get back to work. That plasma cutter is not going to calibrate itself." Outside the viewport, station continued its slow orbit around the purple gas giant. Ships came and went. Traders haggled in the markets. Miners descended into the asteroid tunnels. Life went on, ordinary and unremarkable, the way it always had. But something had changed, something that could never be unchanged. A mechanic had answered a child's plea. And the galaxy had noticed.